Cliff House is older than anyone alive. Sure, it's burned down a few times.
Famous restaurant closed 2 years ago, a victim of the pandemic, like so many other landmarks. Until a new restaurant opens, though.
For more than 150 years, the Cliff House stood as San Francisco's crown on the edge of the world, a place where the city met the sea and where dreams met disaster. But behind its iconic photographs lies a saga of fire, fortune, and rebirth. Why did this landmark rise and fall so many times? Who kept rebuilding it? And why does it still matter today? From explosions to earthquakes to the final closure in 2020, this is the real story behind the palace that refused to die. Birth on the Edge, 1863. Before it became one of San Francisco's most photographed landmarks, the Cliff House was little more than a dream, balanced on the edge of the world. The year was 1863. The Civil War raged on the other side of the country, and California was still finding its identity after the gold rush. The city of San Francisco was young, raw, and restless. A booming port filled with saloons, gamblers, and fortune-seekers who had traded pickaxes for ambition. At the far western edge of the city, past the sand dunes and scrub-covered hills, the land simply fell away into the Pacific Ocean. The cliffs there were wild and windswept, battered by waves that exploded against jagged rock. The sea foam hung in the air like mist, and seabirds circled endlessly above the roar of the surf. Few people ventured that far west. There were no easy roads, no cable cars, no comfortable routes. It was a place for adventurers, hunters, and dreamers, the kind of souls drawn to the horizon. Into this rugged setting came Senator John Buckley and his partner C.C. Butler, two men who saw something extraordinary in that untamed edge of land. They imagined a refuge, a place where city dwellers could escape the noise and grime of San Francisco and breathe in the ocean's wild air. Together, they built what would become the first Cliff House, a modest yet elegant structure perched daringly above the crashing waves. Reaching it was part of the adventure. Visitors had to journey across dunes on horseback, by wagon, or even on foot, braving the strong ocean winds that carried salt and fog into their faces. But those who made the trip were rewarded with views unlike any other. Endless blue stretching to the horizon, the distant shape of the Farallon Islands on clear days, and the hypnotic pull of the Pacific. Inside, the Cliff House was cozy and inviting, with large windows facing the sea and a dining room warmed by wood fires. It quickly became a gathering spot for locals looking for something different. Horseback riders stopped there for lunch. Hunters returned from Land's End to rest, and picnickers spread blankets along the cliffs. It was a place where the wealthy and the working class shared the same view, united by awe at the ocean's power. In an era when San Francisco was still carving its place in the world, the Cliff House offered something rare, a reminder that nature's beauty could rival any man-made fortune. The building's charm spread by word of mouth. Newspapers called it a house on the edge of heaven. Couples rode out on weekends for romantic dinners. Families made day trips, bringing baskets of food and wide-eyed children who watched the sea lions on the rocks below. The Cliff House became a symbol of possibility, proof that even in a city driven by gold and grit, there was room for wonder. But behind the beauty, the location came with danger. The cliffs were unstable, and the relentless surf gnawed at the rocks beneath. On stormy nights, the building creaked and swayed with the wind, and waves sometimes crashed high enough to spray the windows. Buckley and Butler's creation was bold, even reckless, a statement of confidence against nature itself. Yet that daring spirit became part of the Cliff House's identity. It stood not in defiance of the ocean, but in partnership with it. For a time, life at the Cliff House was peaceful. The restaurant thrived, its visitors growing from a handful of locals to tourists from across the state. It was a piece of civilization at the edge of chaos, a place where the land met the sea and humanity dared to linger. But the Pacific, as San Franciscans would learn again and again, has a long memory and little mercy. Because before long, one man with a grander vision and one disastrous explosion would forever change the fate of the Cliff House. The next chapter begins with a new owner, Adolf Sutro, a millionaire dreamer who wanted to turn the ocean's edge into a paradise for the people, until fire and dynamite tested his dream to the limit. Sutro's vision and the 1887 explosion. By the early 1880s, the first Cliff House had begun to fade. The novelty was wearing thin, and the once bustling coastal refuge was falling into disrepair. The wind had stripped paint from its walls, the ocean air had eaten into its timbers, and the crowds that once arrived on horseback and wagon had grown fewer each year. But just as the tides reclaim what man forgets, fate was about to send someone who would breathe new life into the cliffs, a man whose dreams were as vast as the ocean itself. His name was Adolf Sutro. To San Franciscans, he was already a legend. A self-taught engineer and immigrant from Prussia, Sutro had built his fortune solving one of the West's most dangerous problems, draining and ventilating Nevada's Comstock lode silver mines. His ingenuity had made him a millionaire, but his heart was still that of a visionary. He believed beauty and knowledge should belong to everyone, not just the wealthy few. When Sutro bought the Cliff House in 1883, he saw it not as a business, but as a gift to the people of San Francisco. The western shore was wild, magnificent, and almost unreachable. Exactly the kind of place he thought ordinary citizens should enjoy. Sutro began improving the area around the cliffs, adding walking paths, gardens, and viewing points. He even imagined a vast seaside complex, an idea that would later evolve into the Sutro Baths, one of the grandest entertainment venues in the world. Under Sutro's ownership, the Cliff House regained its charm. The building was repaired and repainted, and once again became a destination for families, travelers, and even the city's elite. On weekends, carriages lined the coast road as visitors came to dine, watch the sunset, and marvel at the ocean. The Cliff House was thriving again until one January morning in 1887, when the peace was shattered by an explosion so violent it was heard across the city. On January 16, 1887, the schooner Parallel was navigating the waters near Land's End when tragedy struck. The ship, carrying a cargo of dynamite and oil, ran aground on the rocks below the Cliff House. The crew struggled to control the fire that broke out on board, but moments later, the unthinkable happened. The vessel exploded with a thunderous roar that shook the entire coastline. Witnesses miles away reported seeing a flash of light followed by a plume of smoke rising hundreds of feet into the sky. The blast blew out windows across the western neighborhoods and sent debris raining down onto the cliffs. The north wing of the Cliff House was torn apart, its walls splintered and roof ripped open. People dining inside were thrown from their chairs as the building trembled. Miraculously, no lives were lost inside the restaurant. The explosion's fury was directed outward toward the sea, sparing those within, but the damage was immense. The once graceful Cliff House now stood wounded on the bluff, its frame broken and windows shattered. Newspapers described the scene as apocalyptic. Glass littered the cliffs, and the smell of smoke and salt hung thick in the air. For many business owners, such a disaster would have been the end, but not for Adolf Sutro. He saw the explosion as a test of resilience, not a final chapter. Within weeks, he began repairs, hiring craftsmen to rebuild stronger than before. To him, the Cliff House wasn't just a building. It was a promise that San Francisco's beauty would always rise from its own ashes. By the time repairs were complete, the Cliff House had reclaimed its place as the city's seaside treasure. But destiny wasn't finished with it yet. The ocean that had spared it once would soon watch it burn, and this time, the fire would consume everything. On Christmas night in 1894, while San Francisco slept under winter skies, flames devoured the Cliff House once more, and Sutro would answer the loss with a creation unlike anything the coast had ever seen. The Gingerbread Palace, 1896. It was Christmas night, 1894, when the Cliff House met its cruelest fate yet. Inside, the last guests had finished their holiday dinners. Outside, the ocean crashed against the rocks as it had for centuries. Somewhere within the walls, a single spark caught, a defective flue, a forgotten ember, and within minutes, flames began to crawl upward through the wooden frame. By the time the fire was discovered, the wind had turned the blaze into a monster. Witnesses described the scene as both tragic and beautiful. The entire coastline was illuminated by the inferno as the Cliff House, glowing like a lantern against the sea, burned to the ground. People gathered on the dunes and cried as the structure collapsed into itself. For decades, it had been San Francisco's jewel at the edge of the world, a place of laughter, romance, and ocean air. By morning, nothing was left but smoke, embers, and ash. For many, that Christmas fire marked the end of an era. But for Adolf Sutro, it became the beginning of a legend. He refused to let the sea have the final word. Less than a year later, construction crews began to rise again over the cliffs. This time, Sutro didn't just rebuild a restaurant, he built a dream. When the new Cliff House opened in 1896, it stunned the world. 7 stories high, rising from the bluffs like a fairy tale castle, it was unlike anything San Francisco had ever seen. Locals called it the Gingerbread Palace. With its steep gables, pointed spires, and delicate wooden trim, it looked more like a royal chateau than a seaside inn. Visitors said it seemed to float above the Pacific, shimmering through the fog like a vision. The building was not just architecture, it was theater. Sutro had spared no expense. Inside were dining rooms lined with fine woodwork, parlors with panoramic windows, and grand staircases that wound up to towers where guests could gaze out across the endless ocean. The interior balanced elegance with warmth. Velvet drapes, polished brass, and roaring fireplaces that cast golden light against the carved walls. The new Cliff House quickly became the pride of San Francisco, a gathering place not just for locals, but for dignitaries and world travelers. Presidents, writers, and actors visited to see the view that seemed to belong to another world. It was a place where people came to dream, to dine, and to feel the ocean's power without fear of its reach. And just beyond it, Sutro's greatest project of all was taking shape. The Sutro Baths, a colossal glass-enclosed wonderland featuring 6 indoor pools, gardens, art galleries, and exotic displays. Together, the baths and the Cliff House turned the western edge of San Francisco into one of the most extraordinary entertainment destinations on Earth. On weekends, thousands arrived by horse-drawn carriage, bicycle, or the new steam rail that carried visitors straight to the ocean. They picnicked by the shore, watched the seals on the rocks, and marveled at what Sutro had created. A vision of leisure, learning, and natural beauty open to everyone, not just the wealthy. For a brief, shining moment, the Cliff House stood as a symbol of everything San Francisco wanted to be. Elegant, ambitious, and unafraid of reinvention. The city had its castle, its palace by the sea. But as with everything in the story of the Cliff House, light and loss moved hand in hand. Only a decade after the Gingerbread Palace opened its doors, the ground itself would begin to shake. San Francisco would be brought to its knees, and the Cliff House, once again, would face fire on the horizon. The year was 1906. The city would crumble, the earth would roar, and though the Cliff House survived the quake, it would meet its next fate in flames once again. earthquake, fire, and the Phoenix rebuild, 1906 to 1909. When the Great San Francisco earthquake struck on the morning of April 18, 1906, the world seemed to split in two. Buildings crumbled, fires devoured entire neighborhoods, and the city by the bay was reduced to a landscape of smoke and ruin. From downtown to the marina, devastation reigned, but high above the Pacific, the Cliff House stood firm. Newspapers later called it a miracle. The gingerbread palace, with all its delicate towers and wooden lacework, swayed and shuddered under the force of the quake, but somehow survived. Windows cracked, plaster fell, and parts of the outer walls splintered. But the building held. While the rest of San Francisco burned for days, the Cliff House still stood like a sentinel at the edge of the sea, a reminder that even in destruction, beauty could endure. For a brief moment, it seemed that fortune had finally smiled on the cliffside landmark. Crowds returned as the city began to rebuild. Families once again rode the streetcars west to dine above the surf, grateful for a familiar place untouched by the chaos downtown. There was talk that perhaps, after decades of fires and explosions, the Cliff House had finally earned its peace. But fate, as always, had other plans. On the night of September 7, 1907, barely a year after the earthquake, disaster struck again. A fire broke out inside the gingerbread palace, its cause never confirmed. Some said it began in the kitchen. Others blamed faulty wiring or the building's complex maze of chimneys. What is known is that the fire spread fast, feeding on the dry wood and ocean winds that whipped through the cliffs. By the time firefighters arrived, flames were already pouring from the upper floors. The elegant spires and balconies that had once dazzled visitors now glowed red against the night sky. The entire structure was engulfed, and the city watched helplessly as their beloved landmark burned for the second time in 13 years. Newspapers the next day mourned the loss as the end of a dream. Adolf Sutro had passed away years earlier, but his spirit and his family's determination remained. His daughter, Dr. Emma Merritt, refused to let her father's vision die with the flames. A doctor, reformer, and woman of uncommon resolve, she immediately took charge of plans to rebuild once again. But this time, the Cliff House would rise not as a fantasy castle, but as a fortress of grace and endurance. Dr. Merritt commissioned the architectural firm Reed and Reed to design a structure worthy of its history, yet resilient against time and nature. The result was a neoclassical masterpiece, sturdy, symmetrical, and elegant. The new Cliff House, completed in 1909, was built of concrete and steel rather than wood, with tall arched windows framing the horizon and clean lines that reflected the dignity of the new century. Where the gingerbread palace had been ornate and whimsical, this Cliff House was confident and timeless. Its simplicity carried its own kind of beauty, a calm strength born from survival. Inside, it was designed for both fine dining and comfort, a place where San Franciscans could gather once more to watch the sunset and feel that their city had truly been reborn. The timing was symbolic. As San Francisco rebuilt from one of the worst disasters in its history, so too did the Cliff House. It became a beacon of hope, a phoenix rising from the ashes of loss, proving that resilience could take tangible form in concrete and glass. Visitors described it as serene and majestic, a place that whispered of endurance rather than excess. By the time it reopened, the Cliff House was not just a restaurant. It was a monument to survival. It had withstood explosions, fires, and earthquakes, and still it stood. In a city defined by reinvention, the Cliff House had become its mirror. But the story wasn't over. In the decades to come, the building would trade elegance for entertainment, its quiet grace giving way to neon lights, laughter, and the golden age of seaside amusement. The Whitney era and Playland, 1937 to 1970. By the 1930s, the Cliff House had become more than a restaurant. It was a fixture in the soul of San Francisco. The 1909 neoclassical structure stood proudly on the bluffs, its graceful lines overlooking the restless Pacific. Yet the mood of the city had shifted. The Great Depression had left scars across the nation, and the people who came to the coast weren't seeking refinement or formality. They wanted escape, laughter, motion, and music. And that's exactly what they found just down the hill at Playland at the beach. In 1937, two brothers, George and Leo Whitney, purchased the Cliff House. The Whitneys were entrepreneurs with a knack for joy. They had turned the nearby beach area into a wonderland of color and sound. Playland was a playground of roller coasters, arcade games, cotton candy stands, and funhouse mirrors. It was the West Coast's answer to Coney Island, a place where ordinary families could leave their worries behind and trade them for thrills and smiles. The Whitneys saw the Cliff House as a natural extension of that magic. They remodeled it, stripping away much of its neoclassical formality and giving it a more casual, modern personality. Inside, the atmosphere became lively and approachable. A place where visitors could dine in comfort without the pretense of fine china or white gloves. To many, the change marked a new era. The Cliff House became not a monument to the past, but a living part of San Francisco's evolving culture. The laughter of children from Playland drifted up the hill to mingle with the clinking of glasses and the music from the dining room below. Locals and tourists alike came in waves, making a ritual of spending the day on the rides before gathering at the Cliff House to watch the sun sink into the Pacific. For decades, this pairing of Playland and the Cliff House defined the city's seaside identity. It was where first dates happened, where families took Sunday outings, where sailors on leave toasted the ocean, and where returning veterans brought their children to relive simpler times. The smell of salt water, popcorn, and fried dough filled the air. From the windows of the Cliff House, you could look down at the flashing lights of Playland, the wooden coaster's silhouette against the setting sun, and feel that life, despite everything, was good. The mid-century years brought both change and nostalgia. The Second World War and the years that followed transformed San Francisco into a gateway to the Pacific, a city of hope and farewells. Through it all, the Cliff House stood watch. It hosted dances, family reunions, and quiet dinners for couples who remembered the old days when the city was smaller, wilder, and more personal. But like everything tied to the tides, the golden age began to fade. By the 1960s, Playland had grown tired. The rides rusted, the paint peeled, and the laughter grew thinner. The city was changing. Freeways, suburban sprawl, and a new generation with new tastes drew people elsewhere. In 1972, Playland closed for good. Its rides were dismantled, its lots sold to developers, and its memory became part of San Francisco's folklore. Yet, the Cliff House endured. Though its surroundings changed, it refused to surrender its identity. It remained a symbol of the old coastal spirit, weathered but resilient, perched above the ruins of joy that had once surrounded it. The sound of the waves below replaced the echoes of carousel music, and visitors who stood on the terrace could still feel the ghost of Playland in the sea breeze. In those years between the 1930s and 1970s, the Cliff House evolved from elegance to entertainment, and finally to endurance. It adapted, survived, and became a bridge between generations, a place where every San Franciscan had a memory. But the Cliff House story wasn't over. As the lights faded, a new chapter began, one of preservation, where its legacy passed from showman to the nation itself. The National Park years, 1977 to 2003. By the mid-1970s, the laughter of Playland had faded into memory. The roller coasters were gone, the midway was silent, and the cliff house stood alone again, gazing out at the Pacific like an aging monarch, overlooking its forgotten kingdom. The world had changed around it, but the building endured, sturdy, graceful, and symbolic of San Francisco's endless ability to reinvent itself. In 1977, the story of the Cliff House took an unexpected turn. After more than a century of private ownership, it was purchased by the National Park Service and officially made part of the Golden Gate National Recreation Area. It was no longer just a restaurant, it had become a piece of America's heritage. For the first time, the government, not an individual dreamer or entrepreneur, would safeguard the landmark that had weathered storms, fires, and time itself. The decision marked a shift from commerce to conservation. The NPS saw the Cliff House not simply as a business, but as a cultural artifact, a place that told the story of the city's growth, ambition, and resilience. It was a reminder that history could live not only in museums, but in living, breathing spaces. The Cliff House was still serving meals and hosting weddings, but now every plate, every toast, and every sunset, framed through its windows, carried the weight of history. To keep its spirit alive, the NPS partnered with concessionaires Dan and Mary Hauntelis, longtime San Franciscans who understood that the building wasn't just a venue, it was a memory for millions. They took over operations in 1973 and continued after the NPS acquisition, blending tradition with modern hospitality. The Haunteleses treated the Cliff House not as a business venture, but as stewardship. Under their care, it regained warmth, dignity, and a sense of belonging. The late 20th century brought waves of restoration and renewal. The NPS and its partners undertook careful renovations to repair decades of wear from salt air and storms. Engineers reinforced the foundations. Artisans restored the facade to reflect its 1909 neoclassical elegance. The restaurant's interior was reimagined with panoramic glass windows that showcased the vastness of the Pacific. Patrons could now dine with the waves crashing below, seals barking on the rocks, and the sun melting into the horizon, just as visitors had a century before. The Cliff House's new chapter was about balance, preserving the past while welcoming the present. It became both a dining destination and a historical experience, a place where tourists could enjoy a meal while learning about the city's turbulent, triumphant past. The NPS added interpretive displays, photographs, and stories chronicling the building's evolution through the decades. The site became a bridge between eras, linking 19th-century ambition with modern preservation. In 2003, a major renovation was completed, the most extensive since the fire of 1907. The project sought to peel back the layers of time and restore the building's original character. The exterior regained its crisp white lines and classical symmetry, and a new two-story wing was added to expand viewing areas. From these glass terraces, guests could see the ruins of the Sutro baths below. Another of Adolf Sutro's grand dreams, destroyed by fire in 1966, but still echoing his vision of beauty for all. With the restoration complete, the Cliff House entered the 21st century renewed, but grounded in its past. It was once again a place of celebration, where tourists and locals came to mark milestones, weddings, anniversaries, family gatherings, all while surrounded by history. For the NPS, the Cliff House represented a triumph of preservation. For San Franciscans, it remained a beacon of identity, a place where every sunset was a story, and every returning visitor was part of the continuum. The building had now outlived its builders, its founders, and its fires. It stood as a monument to endurance, proof that even on the city's most fragile cliffs, legacy could take root and thrive. But history wasn't done with the Cliff House. Decades later, a new kind of storm arrived, one of silence, not fire or quake, and its doors closed once more. The Final Sunset, 2020. For more than 150 years, the Cliff House stood as a survivor, watching San Francisco rise, burn, rebuild, and reinvent itself. It had endured explosions, fires, earthquakes, and the relentless pull of time. But in the end, it was silence that brought it down. In 2020, as the COVID-19 pandemic swept the world, the Cliff House, once alive with celebrations and laughter, fell quiet. Tables sat empty. The windows that had reflected countless sunsets now framed only waves crashing below, indifferent and eternal. Longtime operators Dan and Mary Hauntelis, who had cared for the restaurant for nearly half a century, fought to keep it alive. But with months of closure, lost revenue, and stalled lease negotiations, even their resilience had limits. On December 31st, 2020, the Cliff House officially closed its doors. For San Franciscans, the news hit hard. It wasn't just a business shutting down, it was the end of a living landmark. The Haunteleses carefully packed away decades of history, menus, photos, and postcards from the many lives the Cliff House had lived. The rustic 1863 inn, the grand 1896 gingerbread palace, and the elegant 1909 rebuild. Each one had risen from disaster before. Each one had seemed eternal. In the final days, locals gathered along the cliffs to say goodbye. Some took photos. Others simply watched the sun sink into the Pacific. The wind was cold, but it carried something timeless. The sound of the ocean echoing through memory. For those who had celebrated birthdays, engagements, and anniversaries there, the closure felt personal. The Cliff House wasn't just a restaurant, it was where countless stories began. Generations had grown up visiting its windows by the sea, each visit becoming part of a shared memory stitched into San Francisco's soul. Today, the building still stands, preserved by the National Park Service as part of the Golden Gate National Recreation Area. Its walls face the same horizon, its terraces still catch the golden light of evening. Visitors walk by, peer through the windows, and imagine the laughter that once filled the rooms. The Cliff House's story didn't end in 2020, it simply paused. Like the tide below, it waits for the next wave, the next dreamer, the next rebirth. Because if San Francisco's history has proven anything, it's this. The Cliff House always finds a way to rise again. The Cliff House was more than a restaurant. It was a witness to everything San Francisco became. Fires, fortunes, earthquakes, and eras all passed, but its spirit never did. What does the Cliff House mean to you? Should it reopen or remain a monument to history? Share your thoughts below. And if you love stories like this, make sure to like, subscribe, and click on the next video on your screen to uncover more lost legends of California's past.